moment from a conservative media perspective, they say, they'll paint this one way or another. But even from more secular media, is that the protest against police brutality and racism is the most important piece. And to your point, grant them that. That is why people were doing the protest. But the religious origin of it often gets obscured or
Mhm.
just ignored altogether.
Welcome to God is Better Than You Think. My name is Joshua Pease, and so happy that you're hanging out with us today, wherever you're at, whether you're in a car, whether you're at your computer, whatever's going on in your life, especially in these crazy times. I'm so glad that you were able to find time to listen to this today. This is a podcast and YouTube channel that basically what we do is try to elevate the voices of people who have a point of view on God, faith, Christianity that often is underrepresented and unheard. These are people who I think have a vital message that if we heard it, would help us realize God is actually far better than we have been told and led to think. Today's guest is Jack Jenkins. He is a religion reporter who specifically has focused on reporting on the religious left, which is in fact a thing. And so, interesting facts about that you'll learn during today's interview is that the Christian left has existed for longer than the Christian right in terms of political engagement and interaction, and actually has had immense amounts of influence over the last decade. And yet, that has been largely unreported on, and it's not something a lot of people know about. So, we're going to be talking a lot about that today, along with some other stuff. You're in for a great interview. Before we get to that, though, I do want to ask you for something really quickly. This podcast and YouTube channel are entirely self-funded by me. Everything from the equipment to hosting to all of that stuff. My dream for this is that we never have to have advertisers. And so if this is a podcast or a YouTube channel that is of help to you and of service to you in your life, I would be so honored if you would give a little bit of money to help keeping this thing happening. So we'll have a link in, whether it's on YouTube or on the podcast you're listening to, we'll have a link there to a Venmo account where you can give anything that you would love to give. And all of this just goes to helping keep this happen. And so if this is something that's been meaningful to you, please give. If it's not, or you're not able to right now, that's totally fine as well. I'm just looking for ways to make this a financially possible thing for me to keep doing, both because I'm starting to hear stories of how this is just really benefiting people's lives, and it's something I'm really enjoying. I'm getting a lot out of this too. So that ends the shameless self-promotion part of this. I am now really excited to get you to Jack. So let's turn it over to him. Far more formal than anything I'm gonna do. I was like,
Okay.
fine, like we're good. All right, man. Well, Jack, thank you so much for making time for this, man. I really appreciate it. How's life on the East Coast right now?
It's been there are fewer flames, fewer wildfires, so they got that going for us. We don't have two hurricanes trying to hit us at the same time, so which is happening down in the Gulf.
Yeah.
So really, all things considered, we're just dealing with global pandemic and massive political logjam. So it's all things considered, not so bad.
So you really have it. You really have it easy, is what I hear you say.
Exactly.
Oh my gosh. Yeah. I don't think there's anywhere you can go right now where there's not going to be some sort of like mid to large sized crisis. How has that? So, for people who don't know who you are a reporter for the Religion News Service. And you've been there for how long now?
I guess coming up on 2.5 years. Actually, probably over 2.5 years now. So yeah.
When I first started following you, you weren't with them yet. And then I watched you kind of journey into being on staff there. How has, like, as a religion reporter, has the pandemic stuff drastically affected your job, or is being a journalist pretty adaptable to all that?
So yes and no. So for instance, before I worked at RNS, I worked at Think Progress, and
Right.
Think Progress was a newsroom. We had like 40 plus people shoved into the same room, all interacting all at the same time. The advantage that we've had at RNS is when I started working there, I mean, we've been working off of Zoom since I got there in 2018, right? So we're actually remote all over the world. we have a small reporting staff, way smaller than Think Progress, but we're globally represented, and we're like a much older institution. RNS goes back to like the 1930s.
Right.
And so we're, when the pandemic hit, the whole working from home bit, we're like, yeah, we know, that's actually something. We had briefly, because we're also in partnership with the Associated Press, some of us had briefly started working at AP offices, and so that had just begun, and then it immediately ended when the pandemic hit. But outside of that, that part of it, hasn't really changed that much because we've been able to continue to work online. But, the pandemic became a part of all of our stories, right? Like it was like within, days of it hitting, it became the thing that undergirded so much of what we did. And even when you're covering something like, when the George Floyd demonstrations happened, which also became a thing we wrote a ton about, all of that is informed by the pandemic. I'm going to demonstrations with a camera and a microphone and like talking to people through my mask and their mask and still trying to like keep socially distant. It's been this thing that, definitely changes the way I've done my job, and certainly changes the stories that I've written. Because, so much of it is about this pandemic. And then admittedly, it also kind of changes the way you report. Whereas previously I was able to, in January and February, I was sent to Iowa to cover, the campaign there. I was sent to South Carolina. That was my last trip. I went to South Carolina for that primary, and I was going to major, rallies and talking to people all over, face to face. And I just haven't been able to really do that, mostly between, beginning about early March. And so much of my job is like text messages, emails, phone calls, in a way that is always kind of true for journalists, but in a way that's like only true during the pandemic.
Something I found, not that I'm a full-time journalist by any means, but when I dabble in journalism, I find that on one hand, you're missing that face-to-face piece, which is so valuable. But then on the other hand, there's an accessibility that I feel like the pandemic opened up a little bit, where there's like people, like even like this YouTube channel / podcast I'm doing right now is largely a pandemic project where I'm like, I bet I could get hold of some people right now who might not my calls
We're
otherwise.
all home.
It's like, I know you have nothing to do. You're at your house right now.
We're all just sitting around, for sure.
Okay, so we are eventually going to get into all things about the religious left, about your fascination with it, your reporting of it. Look, we're going to get there. Before we do that, I would love to hear a little bit about how you ended up as a religion reporter in the first place. Like, why is that something, like, as a 5-year-old child, did you have this dream of like, I'm going to report on religion? I think I've even seen enough to know that maybe you were interested in astronomy growing up, if I'm remembering. But, so how did you end up doing what you're doing right now?
Yeah, no, the short answer is by accident. The longer answer is, I grew up in South Carolina, and in a small town called Aiken, South Carolina, right across the river from Augusta, Georgia, where it was a great place to grow up, but it's in the South, and both my parents are from the South. My dad's originally from South Carolina, my mom's originally from Georgia, and they're both religious. My mom grew up Baptist, my dad grew up military Protestant, which is kind of like a jumble of things.
A catch-all.
And then when they moved to Aiken, because I was technically born in Washington, D.C. I'm an Army brat. My dad was working at the Pentagon at the time. But I missed most of his career and only had to move like twice. And when we got to Aiken, my mom, the best kids program apparently in the town was at the Presbyterian Church. So my family became Presbyterian, and it became a big part of my life ever since. Because that church turned out to be really great as a community. It was interesting because it was this mainline Christian church, and the associate pastor was a woman, and I didn't realize that was weird until I was like in my teens and realized my Baptist friends like couldn't conceptualize this idea. But I was in a small town in South Carolina where that was kind of seen as normal.
Your Baptist friends were wondering why you were voluntarily embracing heresy.
Right, basically, that's basically the questions I got, and I was like, I don't understand why do you have a female pastor? They're better, and her sermons were so much better. I don't understand. So. So the thing about it was that I grew up, and then I did have a stint where I thought I wasn't going to go to college because I had a band and we were going to make it. And
Sure.
one, we were not good and never going to make it. And two, as a consequence, I had two bands and both were terrible. And
Yeah, probably because of that attitude you had about it.
yeah,
Maybe you had a little more positive attitude, Jack.
but
Well, hold on. What was your role in the band?
okay, so it was two different bands, and one of them was like, and they were very different. One of them was like this more folk band where my first instrument, and the only one I'm probably really decent at, is actually harmonica. And
All right.
I'm usually the best harmonica player anyone's ever met because I'm the only harmonica player that most people have ever met.
It's a good
Um,
pitch.
oh yeah, and it's I have been embarrassed by meeting a true harmonica player once in my life, which is a whole other story. But at this band, I got to kind of like play with like two guitarists, and I sang some backup vocals and sometimes lead vocals, but mostly it was kind of like this more folksy folk band. And then the other band was like a rock band,
Yeah.
and it was particularly like I forget what we were in. We had like multiple influences. One of them was like System of a Down. And like just wildly different personas in these two bands, and like we like made the guitars, we like made the electric guitars for the band.
You made them?
um yeah, we like I designed them, and then the guy who had actual talent made it. And
Sure.
then and so we like it was like this whole like we're so hardcore that we like make our own guitars, and like sang a lot of like angsty songs, and all got into almost won the high school talent show one year. We did not win. But so these are the two bands I thought were really great, and then we like did like mini tours, and were
And so, yeah.
quickly disabused of that fact. And so then I ended up attending college, kind of on a whim, at Presbyterian College. That's the name of the college. It's called Presbyterian College,
Okay.
and it's a tiny little liberal arts college in the middle of nowhere, South Carolina. And affiliated with the PCUSA, my denomination. And the cool thing about that, I mean, the frustrating thing about going to a college like that is it's like 1,200 students in the middle of nowhere. It's smaller than my high school,
Right.
and it's like near cornfields and such. But what they did to compensate for that is they really heavily incentivized. Like by the time I left, you could not graduate without studying abroad and or going away for an internship. And
Nice.
so I got to study abroad once for a full semester, and then a couple other times for these like shorter semesters. And what that did was it really kind of piqued my interest in not just like the faith that I was reared in, but like these different faiths. So like one of my trips was to Vietnam, and like Buddhism seemed really interesting to
Hmm.
me while I was there. And then when I was in New Zealand, like indigenous traditions, Polynesian traditions became this thing that was really fascinating to me, kind of expanding my knowledge of religion. And then I still didn't really know what I was gonna like do when I graduated.
Sure.
The short version is that I applied to the Peace Corps and got in, and then they had to defer the deployment for a bunch of us because some stuff went down in the sections we were going to get deployed. And I ended up trying to fill that time by ended up working on some campaigns. And then I did that, ended up just like doing that for a year instead of doing the Peace Corps. And while I was doing campaign work, I applied to divinity school on a whim. Basically, I wrote like most of my application the day it was due in a Waffle House. And um, and,
A lot of really important things have happened in Waffle Houses.
I'm telling you, like it's major moments in my life have happened in the Waffle. Um, so then I ended up getting to divinity school, and I originally went with the idea of potentially becoming a Presbyterian minister, and actually like initiated that process. And it's a long story, but midway through my time in divinity school, my denomination schismed, and
Yeah.
it had like a minor schism over same-sex marriage and LGBTQ ordination. And a lot of us were kind of like trapped in this limbo space where our options were kind of limited. And so time that I otherwise would have been spending probably doing like ordination requirements, I had this kind of summer where I was like, well, what do I do? And a buddy of mine had interned for the Religion News Service. And he was like, hey, the editor-in-chief's going to come do an event here at the Divinity School in a couple of weeks. You should come and get drinks with us afterwards. And you should consider interning with them. And so I did, and I'd written blog posts, but I'd never written an article. And so I had drinks with them and like handed them this resume that was like printed out versions of my blog posts. And for reasons passing understanding, the
Your
then
Waffle
editor
House manifesto.
exactly. Um, for reasons past understanding, the then editor-in-chief Kevin Ekstrom of RNS decided to take a risk on me,
Yeah.
and I got an intern there that coming summer, and it was transformative for me because it was so much fun. That was back when RNS was picked up by the Huffington Post, which at the time was like the front page of the internet, like it was like the traffic place. And so I would write a story and file it at 3, and then when I would go home at like 6, I'd walk into my the place where I was staying, open up the laptop, and like my story would be on the front page of the Huffington Post. And then, because the Washington Post was also a subscriber to RNS, I would pick up the Washington Post later that week, and like one of my stories would be in it. And I was like, this is the coolest thing.
Yeah, this is easy. Why doesn't everyone do this?
Exactly.
I'm feeling this buzz. Let's lean into this.
Well, it was a complete fluke because it was this one niche wire service that had this sort of access. And so
for you're like, this is easy.
exactly, which it definitely isn't. This isn't a normal story for journalism. So then they liked me enough that they actually hired me on contract for my 3rd year in divinity school. And so I actually wrote like daily blog posts for them, and then like wrote some stories for them, and then had to quit so I could finish my my master's thesis. But then, when I got out of divinity school, I did some other kind of mixture of journalism and advocacy work till I managed to write my way into Think Progress and convince them to hire their first and ultimately only religion reporter.
Wow. Okay.
Because I was covering things that they, as some people kind of intimated to me, the editors at the time were like, look, you're writing about these like progressive religious people, and apparently people are reading it, and we don't know why, but like, you just like keep doing it. That'd be great. And then
we don't know why. Like, lean into that curiosity.
Exactly. Like we don't get it, but it clearly is a thing here. You write about the religious right too.
Yeah.
People read that stuff, so just go to town.
Yeah.
And so, so I ended up doing that for Think Progress, and then ultimately ended up back at RNS after that. And so, again, basically by accident.
So I'm excited to pick up there in a second, but I do want to back up a little bit because it sounds like as you somewhere along the line, and maybe this is just your home life, maybe this is the Presbyterian church with the heretical woman pastor, maybe this is your own personal views, but it sounds like there's this pretty sizable, if not, I don't know if liberal would be the right word, but you're definitely from a pretty early state starting to head into a religious path that doesn't line up with what would be considered evangelicalism, conservatism, all that stuff. Did you ever feel, was there a clash that was happening in your world because of that, or did everything around you just kind of affirm that?
So this is a good question. So statistically, if you looked at me on paper, my rearing, I grew up in a white Southern military family, right?
Right. Yes.
And on paper, that should have, lended me to someone who might have, applied to Liberty University or Wheaton College or something,
Yeah.
evangelical route. But through a fluke of chance, we ended up at this Presbyterian USA church, and the PCUSA, the religious tradition that I was reared in, had a lot fewer rules and a lot more and encouraged instead questions. Our Bible studies, our Sunday schools, were a lot of us like who could ask the best question. It was kind of like the competition that would be.
Seriously.
And I remember like but I was in the Southeast, right? Like I was still surrounded by this stuff. So like a couple of friends would take me to like a Young Life encounter, and it felt very different from the Sunday school and the youth group that I was attending.
Yeah.
And I did eventually get to the point where I noticed this dissonance where inside these bubbles, inside my family, inside my church, this all seemed to make sense. None of it felt incongruous with my upbringing, with my family, with my lineage. All of it kind of fit. But when the second I started talking to people just around me about those sorts of things, about faith and how they talk about it, it suddenly felt really different. And it was interesting, at Presbyterian College where I attended, again, since it's in the Southeast, and even though it's called Presbyterian College, a sizable chunk of that population are Southern Baptist or, conservative Methodist. There's also not conservative Baptist, but they were relatively conservative. But like, one thing that came pretty clear is a lot of the theology nerds who were attached to like the PCUSA actually ended up and some of those people that I knew ended up being the ones who would like lead liberal protests and things like that. Were like these like
Yeah.
theology nerds at this school. Again, something
Huh.
that if you attended like other some other institutions that might work in the opposite direction. But in the situations that I was in, all of these communities felt deeply and were deeply and profoundly religious, but they didn't necessarily fit into the same mold that had been built around them, or that the media had built around these communities. And so yeah, I often felt like, while in many respects being a white mainline Christian in the South isn't that big of a deal, as the Bush era occurred, and as particularly in the Trump era, like the kinds of faith that were preached to me and others in
Yeah.
those churches felt very distinct from what was being preached from other pulpits or even presidential podiums. So it was one of those things where I learned about the distinctiveness of the main line while I was growing up,
Yeah.
compared to conservative Christians, as it were. But
No, totally. Yeah. I mean, it's fascinating because, you talk about yourself kind of being this like statistical outlier a little bit. It almost feels like so much of what you're doing now, and I'm not saying this is like necessarily even your like driving intent, but kind of what happened is you're a voice for like normalizing what for you was your life growing up, of like, like, no, we exist, like this was a thing, I grew up around this. You're like Tobias from Arrested Development, like there are dozens of us.
there are dozens of them, dozens. No, I mean, like, as a reporter, I reported on people who are not like me every day. That is my job. But I do, one of the things that I have been able to do as a reporter is it is easier for me to have contacts and resources and sources in the communities that I'm describing to you right now, because it's similar to how I reared. It's why, you'll have one thing I really encourage in newsrooms is newsroom diversity in general, race, color, and creed, but also and sexuality and gender identity, et cetera. But there is also, theological and religious diversity. And that's why you'll see, some reporters who come from evangelical backgrounds have deep sources in those communities, because that's something they knew. And I think it's one of those things where each reporter is asked to extend beyond their biases, because you can't just write about your own people. You can't expect that, and you also can never presume that your own people are always going to be right, and that they're not also, ripe with corruption and things that you need to investigate and pursue truth as the reporter. But it definitely has benefited me as a journalist to be able to have contacts and an understanding of forms of faith that for me felt very natural growing up, that might not feel as natural for other journalists or just other consumers of media.
That's really interesting. So at what point in time, as you're doing all of this, or let me ask it a little bit differently, I would love to hear what it was like for you as someone who grew up with a version of Christianity that felt very like true and real, and you knew a lot of people who were like very genuine in their faith. At what point in time did you start realizing like so much of the Christianity that I see represented on a national scale feels and looks very different than what I grew up with? Like, when did you start having that realization of like there's like the culture war kind of realization?
Yeah, I mean, that was probably, I mean, the earliest signs were like when you would have kids in middle school be like, oh, you go to a heathen church. And I'm like, yeah, like, it's just like, oh, sure. But I mean, like, but it was one of those things too, where, I often kind of, members of my family and other members of these communities kind of get used to this sort of persuasion narrative. You're like, yeah, actually our tradition's really old and has actually been around longer than yours. And so like, yeah, you learn a lot about Christian history as like a way to talk about your faith. But I don't think I really got the political subtext to it until high school, when it was a lot about the ushering in of the Bush era, and kind of seeing the politicized forms of faith really come across, where you would hear people like kind of start to marry God and country, and they meant a very specific form of God and a very specific form of country, which for me was always complex. Again, I come from a military family. And but it was never, but I had difficulty comprehending some of the things that my friends were saying, because it just didn't match my own experience. And then so that began in high school. And then in college, I mean, particularly when studying abroad, studying abroad during the Bush era, I mean, it's not controversial to say, polling backs this up, like the global community, depending on where you are, but also in general, wasn't super stoked about Bush. And that is also relatively true for Trump as well. But
Yeah.
if you studied abroad in that area, you would get comments about it, and like they'd be
The
like,
rest of the world, that's because the rest of the world hates freedom, though, right?
of course, this was Freedom Prize, man. This is the Freedom Fry era.
Right. Yeah.
And so like but like it was one of those things where you would get people from different parts of the world who would stop you and be like, you're this Bush guy, your country believes X, Y, and Z. And some of them, so first there would be like folks that would just blanket associate you with America as one entity, and then there'd be like another level of nuance where it'd be like, oh no, I know that it's this religious right that won that election. Are you one of them? And so it was interesting because for them, they're like, they saw the universe. And I've still run into this in my reporting recently, where outside observers will see that you are either a religious right voter or you are secular atheist agnostic here in the United States of America, and with like very little comprehension of nuance in both of those spheres. And so I remember a lot of times in college, like sitting at bars with people in other parts of the planet being like, okay, so there's a few, and I didn't even have the full knowledge that I had now. I had a very baby version of that, but I was able to say like, look, there are absolutely people who identify as values voters. They're very powerful on election day. They're actually not the majority of Christians in the country to begin with. And like, it's actually not nuanced. And so these were conversations I was beginning to have then. And as any journalist will tell you, once you start really getting into complexity, it really kind of trains you to be a good journalist, because then you're like, oh, I can tell this story and this story and this story. And so that was kind of the awakening for me, as it were, was kind of not necessarily in the United States, but actually, looking out the United States from the outside looking in.
What? Actually, there's one final like kind of background question I was interested in hearing, and then we'll get to like more current stuff. But it's really interesting to me that you had a military dad, and I mean, you just don't fit the stereotype at all, where you have a military parent, you grow up religious, you're in the South, and yet you find yourself in kind of this more maybe middle left space. What was it like, even that concept of country and patriotism for you? Like, what kind of framework did you grow up with of understanding what your interaction with America was?
Yeah, so I appreciate this question. I've kind of spoken before. I mean, journalists like often don't like talking about their backgrounds because we don't inviting people to see us one way or another. Because but one of the advantages I have is I wrote for Think Progress. I wrote for an explicitly ideological outlet for a while, and so I would rather people know that for me, a great journalist isn't somebody who pretends they're an automaton with no opinions. It's somebody who acknowledges about themselves, and then the great virtue is to extend yourself beyond that, to tell fair stories about those you may disagree with, not even particular like that's not your job. Is not to tell the world what you believe. It's to tell a story accurately. And so I say that because I grew up in a household where initially there was a lot of actual my parents loved each other very much, but there was a lot of political tension in the household. My dad leaned more conservative. My mom, who was a school teacher, leaned more liberal. And but they didn't debate politics. There was just like an understanding that they might vote differently in the ballot box. And my dad, but my dad was interesting because he grew up in a military family himself. My grandfather was first a Marine and then entered into the Army because the Marines had a cap. You couldn't become an officer without a college degree, and he didn't want to get that, so he joined the Army instead and climbed up the ranks that way. And my dad kind of grew up as an Army brat, moving around. Like he spent like his high school years actually in Alaska, that sort of thing. And my dad was a West Point grad. And for me, that's relevant because my dad really held on to that structure of understanding patriotism and even the military from this sort of West Point perspective. And everything I know about that school I know through my family, my dad. I haven't attended there or done a deep dive, but what I learned from him is like the kind of patriotism that my father really kind of ascribed to, and my mother as well, with some more pieces of nuance. And my dad was a Vietnam War veteran, did 2 tours in Vietnam. I'm pretty sure my mom was like protesting while my dad was over there. Like it's like, to give you an idea about the tension. But my dad like really kind of ascribed to this version of patriotism that like when he came back from Vietnam, it hurt him that there were demonstrators who might have said bad things about him, and yet he always described the idea he fought precisely for their right to do that. And
Yeah.
so, like he kind of, it was this kind of vision of his personal opinions about what people should or should not do, or things that he can and should voice in public as often as possible, or whenever he feels comfortable doing so. As a military person, he was actually kind of reticent to share his views, but he's really celebrated a form of democracy in which there was, very people willing to voice their opinions. And my father, one of the ways that I kind of experienced this growing up was that before the big Confederate flag debate in the aftermath of the Dillon Roof shooting, and I've written about this, my father actually was very public in pushing back against the Confederate flag flying on the State House back in the 90s. He actually got in like a war of words in like the state newspaper with like a deeply conservative, pro-Confederate flag state lawmaker. And my dad made like the military argument for it, which was that he said, where is the flag for the Native American soldier who we fought against? They're just as worthy of fighting. For those who led slave revolts, those are also fellow combatants as I see them. Where is their flag? And he like walked through it. And so again, for him, it was this more kind of patriotism was something that I think the way I kind of ended up understanding it is a nationalist can be someone in its worst forms as someone for whom others are sacrificed for you. And my dad's form of patriotism, and one that I heard in a lot of those military circles, is which they sacrifice for others. And I think that was the lesson that I learned growing up in terms of what, in our family and in those communities in which we operated in, that was the understanding of what true patriotism was, a self-sacrificial idea.
I mean, that's beautiful. I mean, and that's something as a Christian I can get behind, right? It's like that. If that was the form of patriotism I'm seeing all the time, of like, I'm going to figure out how I can just sacrifice for the good of other people, I would be all about it.
Right.
That's not the form of patriotism I have a problem with. Oh, man. That is so interesting. What an incredible gift for you to have all these different things that are shaping your life as you're growing up. Okay, so let's get into kind of what you're currently advocating for. Why, or not advocating for, I don't want to say that. You're a reporter, I get it. But also there are things you're passionate about. When I say advocating, right. I mean, there are topics that you're interested in and you would love for other people to be interested in too.
Yes, that is the kind of advocacy that all reporters engage in, is we think that our stories are interesting and worth your time.
Yeah, 100%. Because they are, and if other people don't realize that, they're the problem. Okay, so... I'm joking, but also seriously. So what is it for you about the concept? So whether it's the book that you just recently wrote, whether it's your work as a reporter, what is it about you, about the religious left, that you think it is so important for people to understand?
Yeah, so I will admit up front that I actually have this interesting thing where I feel like voices in communities that you don't hear about are always kind of like voices in communities that get left behind or ignored are always like a reflexive thing that I'm interested in, irrespective of where they are in the political spectrum. I've written a lot about niche conservative communities, that sort of thing. I'm like, these are interesting because they're ignored.
That is literally the definition of what I'm doing right now, by the way, is trying to find ignored voices, or voices I think are underrepresented in Christianity, and draw attention to them. So yeah, man, we're on the same page.
I'm for that. But the reason that the religious left took on this like exponentially more became exponentially more interesting for me is that, so I kind of traced this in the book in the beginning, where I had, for the Religion News Service, I did this report on the Occupy Wall Street movement, in which I went to go find the religion angle. And I knew there was faith down there, but I was not prepared for how concentrated it was. And I think for me, and I didn't mention this in the book, but what was really interesting about Occupy Boston, which was, the Boston iteration of the broader Occupy movement, is that like divinity school students and seminary students in Boston were like disproportionately represented in the building of that camp, the maintaining of that camp. And it was like interesting. And that wasn't necessarily the same thing at Occupy in New York, although they did also have ample religious presence. I read about, there was the thing called the protest chaplains that showed up on day one that were there waiting for the throngs of demonstrators when they appeared in Zuccotti Park. There was a bunch of people in white albs. And those people were, again, many of individuals who I knew. They were like folks that I'd either gone to church with at Boston or like went to divinity school or like were kind of in these same circles that I was reporting on and had gotten to know in other contexts. And I was like, and I remember like watching some of the protest chaplains like sitting around a table in a bar in Boston, like all tweeting back when that was like a new hip thing to be able to do. Before we understood it as like a cancer on society and was like, erode all of our senses of self. Half joking. But I realized that like they had substantial followings and that they were having an interesting market impact in that immediate space of Boston, just as like 5 religious people. And that they were also having a big impact on the formation of this park. But with the exception of my story, and I don't know if somebody else did this, I didn't see anyone else covering the religion element of that. It was always kind of seen as like cursory or coincidental that there was this religious presence there. And as I continued to do reporting, I kept finding that I was often the only person in the back of some of these demonstrations, not just with Occupy Wall Street, with a bunch of other more progressive leaning, liberal leaning demonstrations where, I was like the one journalist who either was there at all or was covering it from a religion angle. And as a reporter, sometimes you can see that moment as you're like, oh no, that means this isn't a story and I'm trying to like make a story out of nothing.
Yeah.
Or you can be like, I have a unique like story here and other people clearly haven't seen it yet.
This is either the best of things or the worst of things.
Exactly.
Yes.
And so what was interesting is by the time I landed at Think Progress, when I started writing about those communities, there was this like deep readership that kept like that had a deep hunger for reading about these communities. And I thought that was folks who were members of it who were like, oh, we finally feel represented. But there were also, the emails I would get of people who would talk to me about it were like, atheist agnostics or conservatives, or just, regular rank and file religious people who just didn't know that this existed. And as I kept doing more reporting, I started to figure out that like these people were actually having tangible moments of impact in national politics that just like went unreported. And that's why, I kind of, the first chapter of the book, when I talk about the Affordable Care Act fight and how religious people had a disproportionate impact on the creation of the Affordable Care Act, like the formation of the law itself and its passage. And that's not me saying that. Barack Obama said that it wouldn't have passed without Catholic nuns. And so it's one of those things where like, and then no one had really told that story. And so I felt like it was important enough to, put into book form, but also into my work to say like, look, even if you disagree with everything that these people are saying, even if you think that they're heretics, and many people do, it is important that you recognize the impact they're having on American society, the impact they're having on American politics, and the impact they're having on your everyday life. And so, and it just felt like a big story that had gone unreported. And now I have like competition in this beat, and I don't get all the scoops anymore, which is really interesting. But I feel like, just this past week when, watching the Democratic National Convention where religion came up constantly. Now it's like, okay, people can see that and they're fascinated by it. But my point, and I kind of trace this in the book, is that while that felt pretty unique last week, the amount and the volume of religion references, that's not new, nor is it unusual to see religion have an impact in progressive spaces, liberal spaces, or within the Democratic Party. So that's basically the gist. Is I am both genuinely interested in it, like on a personal level, and I think a lot of reporters have that, but also just like, the pitch I can make to an editor is like, this seems to matter in a real way. 100%. And it's a politician. Yeah, go ahead.
Oh, no, I'm with you. I was just like, yeah, like everything you're saying. It's like, what's been fascinating to me to watch has been the Democratic willingness to talk about something that I feel like always felt like a very private thing. So for instance, the first time I really had any grasp of who Barack Obama was right before he became a presidential candidate. But I think it was after he gave like the response to the State of the Union one year. I don't remember what year that was. But before he really, really was like, this guy is making a run at president. And I, excuse me, I heard this talk that he gave to some Catholic organization. I don't remember which one, but where he talked very honestly about his own faith journey, and it was powerful. I mean, it messed me up. Of like, at that point in time, I was still probably a fairly conservative. I found myself very conservative leaning politically, and yet
Mhm.
I'm hearing this person who is becoming kind of this liberal all-star who's talking very honestly about his own faith journey. I'm like, man, this guy is him and Jesus have some stuff going on. This is really interesting to me. And but then even in like, I mean, it wasn't something he talked about a ton. I mean, that was something he seemed fairly not reticent exactly, but it just wasn't something he was wearing on his sleeve, to the point where I think a lot of people are like, this guy's not even a Christian, blah blah blah. I'm like, I don't know. I mean, I think it's runs pretty deep for him. And to watch now how it's becoming something that Democrats are being far more vocal about. Why do you think that is? What's happening where the Democratic Party is starting to say, like, no, this is going to be something that we talk more about?
So I think there's several contributing factors there. One, I actually think is Obama himself. I mean, I think that I hear you when you say that, like, it wasn't like he didn't get up on the stump speech and was like, "Hey, I'm Barack Obama
Right.
and I'm a committed Christian." Like, that's not how he would push it. But he did have one of the largest faith outreach teams of any
Right.
presidential campaign in 2008. And then he like dedicated a chapter in his book just to faith, and that was kind of like this radical. And his "I'm going to run for president" book, "The Audacity of Hope," like, everyone has that "I'm going to run for president" book. And
Yeah.
because he'd written like a real amazing like life journey one, which was like "Dreams from My Father," and then he had to be like, "Oh, I got to write the president one." And the title of that book is actually a reference to a sermon, "Audacity of Hope," by Jeremiah Wright, which turned out to be a double-edged sword for him. Um, but
Uh-huh.
the point of that was that, like, I think Obama had to go back and forth when it came to faith, because he actually claimed it more than a lot of previous politicians had. But religion in the broad sense proved to be both his greatest strength and a liability, right? Because he would have moments like, he had delivered whole talks to these Catholic groups and to like Sojourners groups, and like dedicated a chapter of his book to talking about his own faith. And then, the line "they cling to guns and religion" became this thing where, like, he had to invoke the fact that he'd said those things in the past to kind of push past it. It was actually Hillary Clinton who kind of attacked him for that, saying
Yeah.
he didn't understand faith. And then when he became president, one of the biggest, again, the nuns helped pass the Affordable Care Act, but the big story
Mhm.
there is they did that in contradiction of the U.S. Catholic bishops who had come out against it, and they became one of the big opponents of the Affordable Care Act after it was passed, in terms of pushing back on the contraception mandate, et cetera, et cetera. And so he kind of had to waffle back and forth, but the work had already been done to
Mm.
kind of lay the groundwork for faith being a part of this. Meanwhile, you had groups like the Center for American Progress, actually, with John Podesta, helping kind of develop faith as this, in reaction in many ways to George Bush's reelection.
Mm.
That seemed to spark a bunch of like smaller movements within Washington to kind of say, "Hey, we're going to talk about faith." Meanwhile, whole sections of the country and whole sections of the Democratic Party had never stopped talking about it. Black Protestants in particular
Oh,
had
sure. Yeah.
never stopped, saying that this is a part of who we are, this is a part of our understanding of the body politic, is there's a theological undercurrent to it, and then those voices were given more exposure in other parts of the Democratic Party. So by the time you got to 2016, actually, people forget, people wrote articles about the 2016 Democratic National Convention, about how religious that was. And
Mm.
you had people like William Barber who
Mhm.
were speaking at that convention. And then in 2012, Sister Simone Campbell, the head of Network, a Catholic Social Justice Lobby, also spoke at the convention. The reason that both of them were speaking at the Democratic conventions, and the reason neither of them were doing explicit endorsements per se, is because they both achieved this thing where they were the biggest and most notable progressive activists in
Mm.
that last year.
Mhm.
So the
Mhm.
Nuns in the Bus Tour got national exposure because it was like Catholic nuns, and Catholic nuns would pull way better than bishops, who
Yeah.
were
That's
like
yeah.
leading this against Paul Ryan. And then the Moral Monday movement that William Barber kind of got started in North Carolina, the critique of the conservative legislator there, that had been was touted as the largest liberal demonstration of 2013 and 2014. And
Mm.
so by the time you got to 2016, he's like, the big core of activism had become these progressive religious people.
Mm.
And then Hillary Clinton herself didn't invoke faith, I think, as much as a lot of faith advocates wish that she had. But by the time you get to this election, all of that groundwork had been set up with these activists and Obama talking about faith. And when Trump became president, it spurred a collective movement among religious activists where because they had shown this proclivity and talent for activism, they came out of the woodwork in a way that they hadn't and they never stopped advocating, but now they really came out. And so it kind of felt like it was in the ether to talk about it. I think, come 2020, and it helps that Joe Biden has been pretty public about his faith in the stump for like basically his entire political career. Sure. So it's not like it's an easier thing for him to. It's not like a reach for him to talk about it. He's been public about it for a while.
Kind of fits his vibe, yeah. I mean, why? I'm curious to hear your thoughts on this. You know, there has been religious left has been actively at work for a very long time. And I think you even said earlier, it's like, that their political involvement actually predates the religious right by quite a bit. Why was the religious right far more I don't know if effective is the right word, because I don't as a religious Christian, I'm not sure if I think it was very good. But why was the religious right so much more inclined toward this national mobilizing in a way that the religious left wasn't? Like, why did that take off in the 80s, early 90s, and the religious left, it feels like maybe just now is starting to do more of that kind of bigger collective mobilizing?
So I appreciate this question, and I apologize if I get boring, but I actually think I think it actually goes back to the 1930s.
Excellent.
And so in the early 20th century, liberal Christianity kind of won in the public political sphere, right? So there was these movements for the social gospel with people, with pastors like Walter Rauschenbusch that said like, hey, the Industrial Revolution might have given us a lot of like cool things, but it left a lot of workers in like horrific destitution and like child labor and things like that. And let's talk about social sin, like this system that we set up can be real bad. And then that happened alongside liberal Christians kind of like using archaeology and science to dig into their Bible, kind of the historical critical method, the term that's often used. And that kind of neither of those things sat well with some more conservative members of their churches who then, published the fundamentals of Christianity. They became what we now call what they started calling themselves fundamentalists. And you started seeing all these fractures happen in denominations. That's relevant because while the Prohibition movement, for instance, and the Scopes monkey trial, while there was actually some, bipartisan support for those sorts of things and didn't necessarily fit neatly into categories of liberal and conservative that we have now, some of the strongest proponents for those causes were these more relatively conservative Christians. So when they kind of lost in that public sphere, liberal Christianity kind of like became the top dog. The National Council of Churches was like this very influential thing. A lot of these like very prominent mainline pastors had like huge churches. It was like this, they had kind of won. And in many ways, the more conservative groups kind of retreated from the public sphere. Now, what they did in the meantime is there's a whole book that Kevin Cruz wrote, One Nation Under God, where he kind of talks about how a bunch of businesses got involved and actually, because they wanted to push back against this social gospel thing that ended up like playing a big role in the formation of the New Deal. And so they were like, we're going to push a form of faith that's like God, country, and money. And so like prosperity gospel and Christian nationalism fused into one. And that kind of became this thing that happened. And then a lot of conservative Christians started forming their own institutions, right? So like the big main Christian publication was like the Christian Century. So they're like, to heck with that, we're going to form Christianity Today. And then like, hey, you have all these schools that like, might be affiliated with traditional mainline denominations. We're going to form our own colleges. We're going to form our own publishing houses. We're going to form ultimately our own news networks, our own radio shows. And so this whole different ecosystem that exists outside of the normal political, not normal, but the normative political world of religion and politics got created. And in some ways, the normative pieces of mainline Protestantism in particular became like secularized. Like it just kind of became like the values that mainline Protestants had put in there kind of became normative political ideas. Fast forward to the 1980s, and you have same-sex marriage and abortion and or more at that point, really abortion and opposition to, the Red Scare. The religious right said, hey, we can capitalize on this, and we've got a whole apparatus behind us ready to go.
Mhm.
And so what you saw over the course of the 80s and the 90s was this group and this system and this political system that had been decades in the making suddenly get activated.
That's so fascinating. Sorry, go
Yeah.
ahead.
And then the other part, I'll just be real quick about progressive communities. Again, they never stopped. In the 60s, one of the biggest moments of the religious left was, of course, the civil rights movement, right? And so what you ended up finding is kind of as the parties began to realign, where the Democratic Party, the modern left, is significantly less white and wealthy than it had been, particularly less white than it had been before then, granting people the right to vote, things like that previously did not have it. What we get is this party where the religious left, wasn't this sort of institution that had a great access to power. It was often religious communities that have been historically disenfranchised. And what you'll see is that whereas the religious right is very effective at the ballot box and in the courts, two very important systems of power, there are whole communities that didn't have access to either of those systems for quite some time, and some of whom still don't. But one great way of impacting politics outside of the law and the ballot box has traditionally been protest. It is one of the great resources of disenfranchised communities, is that if we don't have access to power, we can at least assemble. And so that's where you kind of see the religious left continue to operate and then shine, is that these communities have protest as a mechanism and have been proven very effective at it. And that is significantly more complicated than the kind of religious right project. Particularly when those communities become more diverse, when you have more different religious voices in the room, and you're having to get a bunch of people who look, act, pray differently to work towards the same goal.
Oh, dude, that's such a good point. Okay, I love that. So, oh gosh, just so many things. Gotta focus my brain here. So the last thing you said is the thing that my brain grabbed onto. I recently meaning, I don't know, 3 months ago, something like that, I attended a Black Lives Matter protest up in Denver, and I mostly it'd been a cause that I had felt a passion about for a while, but I hadn't really attended any sort of protest up until that point. I go mostly just curious. I just wanted to see what was happening. And I ended up going, just kind of landing at this protest of someone who was an ordained minister, where they start and end the protest in the name of Jesus. And then also very much along the way acknowledge, not everyone, we know not everyone here, this is your thing, and that's fine, and you're welcome, blah, 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 but this is who we are. And so what I saw happening, I saw someone, an ordained minister in the name of Jesus, leading a group of people in Jesus's name who represented a bunch of different ethnic groups, a bunch of different political backgrounds, a bunch of different philosophical backgrounds, the vast majority of which probably didn't identify as church-going Christians, and yet led them all toward a cause of justice in the name of Jesus. And I'm like, what the hell are the rest of us doing? I was like, and it happened, and you can't make this crap up. It happened on the day of Pentecost.
Oh, wow.
It was the day that I was there. And I'm like, I just saw a better representation of Pentecost, of the gospel going to all nations and all peoples, the Holy Spirit just being on the move. I saw more of a representation there than I had seen in my 13 years of working at a church.
Wow.
It was such a powerful moment. And to your point, up until that point, I had mostly known these conservative, more established movements that are organizations and nonprofits, and they have grassroots networks and all that. And then I'm looking at this and I'm like, that's never going to make the news. No one's ever going to focus on, not never, because you're out there doing stuff like this, but that's not no reporter showed up and found that to be the interesting angle. And fair enough, I don't expect them to. The interesting angle is a whole bunch of people showed up to protest the injustice of what happens to Black people on a day-to-day basis. No judgment, but as a passionate follower of Jesus myself, I was like, we need more of this.
And to your point, I mean, that's often something that happens in progressive religious demonstrations, is that the religious element will get subsumed. So, for instance, one of the big critiques that the president has lobbed is that, like people who kneel for the national anthem, and he's like, we stand for our national anthem. And for me, I'm always like, that's fascinating that you're taking that position, because one, there are entire religious groups like Mennonites who do not play the national anthem at their schools for religious reasons. Jehovah's Witnesses do not say the Pledge of Allegiance, and they had to win that Supreme Court fight. And this is a fascinating piece of history, because they originally, the Supreme Court sided against the Jehovah's Witnesses and said that you had to say it. And then there was widespread violence and murders of Jehovah's Witnesses, to the point where the Supreme Court had a different decision 3 years later, where justices changed their mind on this issue.
When did that happen?
It was 1940s. 1940 and 1943 were the two different decisions.
Never heard that before. That's amazing.
And so, like, and then many of these people who have kneeled, many of these athletes, many of these performers have invoked their faith as the reason that they are doing it.
Totally.
But that part, I mean, it is saying that our faith compels us to demonstrate against, with their demonstrations are described as demonstrations against police brutality and racism. But what gets taken from that moment, from a conservative media perspective, they say they'll paint this one way or another. But even from more secular media, is that the protest against police brutality and racism is the most important piece. And to your point, grant them that. That is why people were doing the protest. But the religious origin of it often gets obscured or just ignored altogether, to the point where it looks like all these are secular movements in which they don't even notice the opening and closing in the name of Jesus, as you pointed to.
And again, that's fine. And again, just bringing my own strong opinions to the table. As a follower of Jesus, I kind of prefer that. Like, I don't need Jesus's name used as a source of control to try to control people into making something happen. That fits the kingdom of God far better for me. I want to circle back around to something you were saying before, though. I wrote recently, I wrote an article literally for the Southern Baptist Convention, which was interesting. It's a long story, but it was really fascinating, because I was writing, it was an oral history, and I interviewed a bunch of Southern Baptist professors who are historians about the basically it was the history of the Southern Baptist Convention immediately following World War II. And this organization is a PR firm that was writing a bunch of articles, and it was all like, how did the Southern Baptist Convention respond after these moments of crisis, and it kind of framing the coronavirus and all that stuff. Mm-hmm. One of the things that I really learned was, to your point, there's this perception of a liberal agenda that's taking over, and so the Southern Baptist Convention goes from having 2 seminaries to 6 in the span of just a few years. And there are conservative seminaries deliberately designed to be conservative in their approach and in their philosophy. It's deliberately designed. And again, I'm not even critical of that. I'm not saying that from a value statement. I'm just saying there was a perception of, we don't like this theology, so we're going to create these things. And out of that come these magazines, out of these come eventually radio stations, all that stuff. It's so fascinating to me. I've never thought about this before. How what that was doing was sowing the seeds. It was creating this, it was creating a foundation for the religious right to then take and use as a tool to instantly have okay, we have our group, we have our voice, we have our people, because we've created a container for that for the last few decades.
Right. And it's one of the reasons why opponents of the religious right, some argue that they didn't see it coming. They're like, I don't understand, where did all this come from? And they're like, that's because you're not getting the magazines. You're not listening to these radio stations.
Yeah.
And this is a whole sphere of influence for a group of people.
And a slow build of frustration, which maybe was legitimate. I don't know. I'm not an expert.
I mean, yeah, they didn't feel represented in politics.
They felt actively pushed to the side and ignored. They felt like their values and point of view was not being represented. And in fairness, I mean, and I don't know how you feel about this, but as someone who's had the gift to write for the Washington Post once, and some other major, including the New Republic, which is incredibly liberal, I don't see, I mean, I don't mean that negatively. It was wonderful. I loved writing for them. My perception isn't that there's ever this agenda that any of these places are trying to get through. The worst criticism would be sometimes there are blind spots. I think that sometimes if you get a bunch of reporters, and I actually interviewed someone a few weeks ago where she said, I don't think the problem is a philosophical problem as much as unfortunately, journalism largely only is pulling from Ivy League schools now, and it's
Yeah,
actually a class
yeah,
problem. I was like, I've never heard that before.
it's very true. It's significant, and I mean, like, and with religion in particular, I mean, it was the editor in chief of the New York Times in a post-mortem after the 2016 election. I have a lot of feelings about like journalists that beat themselves up about the 2016 election that I will not detail. But one of the things he says that he was mea culpaing on
Yeah.
was that he was like, look, I feel like we missed religion. Now they had the New York Times at the time had one of the best religion reporters, if not the best religion reporters on the beat, who has since moved on to become an editor. But the implication was that they were like, okay, we're gonna up this. We're gonna have like more than one, and
Yeah.
they now have two as of like 2 weeks ago.
We did it. Mission accomplished.
And so like, but it's one of those things where like that's less of an indictment on just the New York Times. That's industry wide, right? The CNN has one religion reporter. MSNBC doesn't have one to my knowledge. I don't know if Fox has one. The only major media outlet that has a robust religion team is actually the Washington Post, which has two or three depending on the week. And that's why they'll break major stories in that space. And so it ends up becoming a blind spot where I do think that people in 2016 missed the influence of religion, or at least Christian nationalism as an identity. And I think part of that's just because they didn't have not because they don't have smart people working for them, and not because you need a religious person to cover religion. You just need someone to concentrate on it.
Oh, totally. Okay, so here's something what do you, if you had to guess, and I know that's not necessarily a reporter's job, but if you had to guess, what does the future of Christian political engagement look like? Where are we heading?
Well, I don't think the religious right is going away. So I think that we should acknowledge that. I do think Trump has introduced a very odd nuance in that he has politicized the prosperity gospel in a way that it hadn't previously been politicized.
Interesting.
Prosperity gospel often kind of benefited from not being overtly political. It makes more money. I mentioned that whole like group of businesses that got involved back in the 1930s. I should note that was called the spiritual mobilization movement.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the people who ran them was this guy who was one of the early mega pastors. Drove around in a very nice car and had very wealthy congregants. And then one of the earliest modern prosperity gospel preachers was this guy named Norman Vincent Peale.
Yeah.
And he was asked to run the like Kevin Cruz told me this for an article I wrote. It didn't end up in his book, but this is apparently something he found. He was asked to run the spiritual mobilization movement, and he said no. And like the implication being that he could make more money selling his books and at his church. Now, to be clear, Norman Vincent Peale was Donald Trump's pastor, and he's one of the only people that Trump can name by name and like recall his sermons in terms of like a pastor that he had experience with. And so fast forward to today, and that same general idea was persistent in that prosperity gospel preachers didn't get too involved in politics. It was something that could cut their bottom line. That's what the critics would say. And they would say, I just don't need to get involved with that. But then you have suddenly Paula White, who is involved with his campaign, and several other prosperity preachers. And so that's going to change things a little bit because they're not the rank and file culture warriors that we knew from past years, more like Tony Perkins style, that sort of stuff, where it was more like we have an organization and we may have an agenda. So I don't think that's going away. It just might have some interesting new nuances. I also think that there will be some fracturing within that. Like Russell Moore was very vocal about his opposition to Donald Trump back in 2016, and I don't think
because of it, but yeah.
And I don't know. It's one of those things where he says that his job was always secure. He definitely wasn't short on critics because of it. And
you can say whatever he wants.
and it's one of those things where and he hasn't said much this year either with regard to he hasn't been anywhere near as vocal this year as he was back in 2016 in terms of criticizing Trump. Now, what I'm really curious about is if Trump wins again, I would expect the religious left's current mode of activism to continue. That there's this several different disparate groups that have really kind of joined together at big, larger campaigns and actually had potential impacts. if Joe Biden wins, there's a question for the religious left and the left in general, which is that the current modern left is this coalition of coalitions. It is a lot of alliances forged, through blood, sweat, and tears, in a way that is not the same kind of challenge that the right has. I mean, the right is just generally less diverse, both religiously but also racially, than you're going to find on the left. And that same challenge exists for the religious left. And so, in lieu of a uniform cause in opposing Trump and opposing his agenda, there's a question for the religious left and the left in general of whether or not those alliances stay as firm as they have been.
Yeah.
And the religious left has often been its strongest, and this is why I call the book American Prophets, when they are being prophetic. And prophets don't actually run for office. They're not president prophets. The one was actually the head of the Mormon tradition, did actually die while running. He was assassinated while running for president of the United States. Joseph Smith. That's how he died.
I never knew that. That's amazing.
Yeah. With that exception, generally don't try to seek power. Generally, they critique power.
Yeah.
And so, we already have. I mean, like a lot of these activists, for instance, William Barber, Linda Sarsour, and others have been perfectly willing to criticize Democrats as well. And so, I would expect that you would continue to see activist pushes that are critical from the left of the left, as well as people who might be more rank and file that support these politicians and help get laws passed. It's a very complicated thing that I kind of help tease out in the book. But that's the question I don't know the answer to, is whether or not these alliances will persist and survive a universe in which Joe Biden is the president as opposed to Donald Trump.
That's fascinating. Just even how the diversity, by default, the diversity of the religious left, just by nature of what it is, also creates a little more of a instability, whereas the religious right, the homogeneity, at least up until recently, like you said, that might be fracturing, but up until recently,
just this past week at the DNC, at the Muslim caucus meeting, Linda Sarsour, a prominent Muslim activist, who was one of the co-chairs of the original Women's March. She was one of the 4 people who helped organize that, who has also proven very controversial in progressive circles. And her presence at that caucus meeting led to the Biden campaign issuing a statement saying this about her, which then led to many activists, including, I'm losing his name, but the healthcare activists who had delivered that, who has ALS, who delivered that very powerful address, him issuing statements and calling the Biden campaign to apologize for disavowing Sarsour. So again, kinds of things that we're going to look at moving forward that the right does deal with sometimes, but with less intensity and with less often than I think the left does.
I personally, one of the things that I've probably felt for about, it's been building, and then it hit in 2016 was when it hit a breaking point for me. Is there any hope of some sort of Christian coalition that could band together that does not represent either the traditional religious left or religious right? Is there a central common ground that could be found that challenges both parties, or is that a freaking pipe dream for me to even hope for that?
So this is not an optimistic time to ask that question, when partisanship has wrenched apart virtually every sector of society, religion included. And one way to answer that question is that we have recently seen evidence that there are issues in which that is possible, right? So immigration reform back in 2013, is that right? And I forget the last, or was it 2011? Sometime in between 2011 and 2013, the last big push for immigration reform was led by both religious left figures as well as many religious right figures who came on board with that. Now, immigration is now proven to be more controversial than it was back then. Same group of people, somehow people suddenly had different opinions about it.
Yeah.
But there have been moments in the one moment of bipartisanship, of prominent bipartisanship under Trump's tenure was the passage of criminal justice reform,
Mm.
which was supported by religious leaders on both sides of the theological aisle, as it were. But evangelicals are very excited. Like conservative evangelicals are very excited to tout that as a victory for them, because they were had the ear of the president, kept bringing this up to him. But there was also many progressive and liberal religious leaders had been pushing for this for quite some time as well. And so you can look and see for like moments of agreement. I mean, even in say the death penalty, we've started to see some overlap between more conservative religious groups and liberal religious groups who, as disapproval of that practice is continuing to rise. It's at levels it hasn't been at in decades. It's fluctuating a little bit, but still higher than it has been in decades. That's an issue in which I think you can see overlap. I think the problem, so I do think there's absolutely issues in which, among Christians in particular and religious people in general, that I do think we can see overlap between the religious left and the religious right. As for whether or not that whole group, if you're speaking just of Christians, could form their own coalition, I am skeptical of that only because in the short term, only because some of the differences that have been elucidated recently seem profound. Insofar as there seems to be, so for instance, I wrote about this a few years ago about sexuality in some conservative religious circles. There's a shifting of what it means to be Christian from more historical definitions of that. And I want to be clear, definitions of Christianity have changed over the course of Christianity's history. It's not like anybody has a monopoly on what it means to be Christian. Like that is a thing that has changed constantly. And if you're a Protestant, you have no claim to any sort of consistent view on religious
as a person who grew up Southern Baptist, I'd like to disagree. I absolutely have a monopoly on it. And how
exactly, it got it right, but not until mid 1800s.
Not until early 1900s did we really figure out what everyone had been missing for the previous 100 years. Yeah.
And so, but I say that there has been this sort of separation of this certain sexual ethic that became central to what it means to be a Christian for some people when it's not others. But the fact that Catholics and Protestants, one of the interesting things about what happened last week is that in 1960, John F. Kennedy had to deliver a speech saying, "No, I'm not going to be run by the Vatican," because certain religious leaders were so scared that he would be run by the Pope. And to the point, one of those people who went and had a meeting concerned about this was Norman Vincent Peale, by the way, and had a meeting in Switzerland about it. And he had to say, "Look, no, I won't be run by the Pope." And then he did not kiss the Pope's ring when he went and visited him after that. It's kind of the show of not deference, which Joe Biden ended up picking up a few years later as a practice as well. I say all that because now we just had a convention where all they did was talk about how Catholic and religious Joe Biden is. And so these fissures that can appear in one stage in American history can completely be realigned within one generation. And I think that it is absolutely the case that in the aftermath of the Trump era, were he not to be reelected, or even if he gets reelected again, and then and somebody else takes office after him, we have seen inflection points in American history where people react to certain moments. History is often a tracing of people learning things the hard way, and it's possible that the reaction to the partisan wrenching apart of American society could be both in a political sense and also in a Christian religious sense, a coming together and saying, "Look, we have significant differences, but maybe we have more in common than we have apart." And being on separate ends, extreme ends of this partisan rancor, didn't seem to help either of us. And I'll say, and I'll close on this point, which is that for a long time, conservative religious groups have said, "Look, just to keep it in the Christian conversation for a second, they've said, look, these liberal Christians, clearly they've got something wrong because nobody's showing up to their churches. You know what I mean? They're hemorrhaging people." Well, now we have evidence that is also happening to the Southern Baptist Convention, that is happening to many conservative churches. And the reason they are leaving is, for many of them, it shows up in polling, are as a byproduct of the public positions and political positions that conservative Christians in general and the religious right in particular have staked out in public. And so you might see this out of desperation, this realignment of Christians, thinking as a futurist in the future of saying like maybe we all kind of did some things that we should work out. Did some Jesus-y things together.
Well, I don't want to talk about who did what to whom. I'm just yeah. Oh man, I hope so, man. As someone who's an advocate far more for me personally, as someone who's an advocate far more for the church than I am any political party, I hope. Okay, so we haven't really talked anything about your own personal faith and where you would land now, and we don't need to necessarily get into all of that. But I will say this: whether it is you can answer this question either as a personal question as a person of faith or as a reporter. I'm fine with either one. But this is someone I ask everyone, and I'm not breaking format for you. Why is God better than we think?
Well, I'm a Presbyterian, so I'm rooted in Calvinist idea that God's amazing and we're just terrible. And
no, God's great. We're the ones who suck.
We're pretty awful. And why is God better than we think? And I mean, and again, for the record, reporters don't want to paint the story with their own belief systems, and I strive every day to not do that. That doesn't mean I don't also have them. I went to divinity school, and right. I don't want to pretend that's not true. For me, I believe in a God that believes in us. I believe that sparks of the divine. The whole point of creation is that it was breathed into us, and that it kind of removes the excuse to pretend that we can't be better. When God has breathed God's essence into each and every one of us. That doesn't mean that we won't be bad. That means that God is constantly trying with each act of creation. If we believe that God is good, and I do, then every act of creation is simultaneously an act of good and a potential for good to continue to occur. And in moments like our current one, where we're beset by a global pandemic and loved ones die. And when we see images like what happened with George Floyd, the deaths of people on camera, and if you work in my industry, where our job is usually to stare at the worst things over and over and over again, our lives are rarely ever as bad as those who we cover. But we do have to stare into that abyss longer than most Americans. It can be really easy to get really cynical. And if you are a religious person, to conclude that God may exist, but like we have to have some hard conversations about whether or not this creation is worth it. But as a mainline Protestant, I think I might defer back to the great sermon of Henry Fosdick, who, when delivering the eulogy for his son, who I believe it was his son, who passed away in a car accident, which if I recall correctly, the car ran off a cliff. The questions of theodicy, why do bad things happen, are ones that I was fascinated with when I was in divinity school. And for me, there has never been a convincing answer. There are only ones that lead in directions that I like. And I remember Fosdick talking about when his son's car flew off that cliff, the first heart to break was God's. And one of the advantages that I've had as a reporter is that while I often focus, we write about bad things that happen, and that religion is not a guarantee that being religious or belonging to a religious institution or being a religious leader or being a pope or being a pastor or being a priest, whatever you are, does not mean that you are divorced from sin. It often means the kinds of sins you can inflict are far worse if you been into them. But I am also constantly inspired by covering of communities and faith communities that in the midst of such chaos, their hearts are breaking with God too, and are doing all the best they can to be there to support others. And so the advantage of being a religion reporter is you get to look at that side too. And so if I believe that God is in all things, then God is in the pandemic, and God is also in those who are handing out masks and tending to the sick and praying alongside them as they die.
And when you're covering some things that maybe even you are the breaking heart of God put into words.
I hope so.
There are times, right, where you're the person witnessing and reporting and giving true statements to it and calling, maybe not as a journalist, maybe not advocating, but in the depiction of truth and the depiction of reality, being a voice that's saying, let's look at this together and let's collectively see what is true and let our hearts break for it. seems to me like that's a big part of what you do. On that note, how can for the people who are watching or listening who are inclined to prayer, how can they be praying for you?
Oh,
I usually catch
first of all, thanks.
That one.
Yeah. It's only sometimes I'll interview pastors who will conclude an interview that way. I'm like, oh gosh. I mean, I think
Gotcha.
I would not just include myself in this. I mean, journalism is in a tough space in general right now. A lot of my friends have been laid off. A lot of them have been furloughed. Fortunately, I haven't been involved with that, but it's also a tough industry, and it's also like tough to be a journalist. Like it is a whole lot of staring into that abyss, and we get tired and we get frustrated, and we don't often always like reporting on the things that we do, and sometimes we really don't want to wake up and do it again. But the truth exists regardless and demands that we tell people about it. So prayers of persistence and dedication in the midst of that. I mean, I talked a lot about my father in this. My father passed away 2 years ago, right. And right around now. And so my family, they've said the second year is the hardest. And so we're in the midst of that. And so if you keep my family in your prayers, I know people who have lost loved ones to COVID. And so I would say that they're just beginning that process that I'm 2 years out from. So keep them in your prayers as well.
Thank you for sharing all that. I appreciate it. If someone is hearing all this and like, I need more Jack Jenkins in my life, what do they do? Promote all the things that you can promote.
Well, if you want to find me, you can find my obnoxious Twitter feed at Jack M. Jenkins.
It's a lot. It's a delightful Twitter feed. I've been following it for a while. Go on.
And I'm also on Facebook, which I update less frequently at Jack. It's the Jack is writing is the thing that comes after the Facebook slash. And then but I really recommend if you're interested in a lot of the conversations we've had today about the religious left, I wrote a book called American Prophets, the religious roots of progressive politics and the ongoing fight for the soul of the country. For the record, I had that last tagline before Joe Biden made it as part of his campaign slogan.
What I heard is that Joe Biden ripped you off. Go on. No, 100% read your book, was deeply impacted by it. I don't think there's any arguing this point. Go
on. So I would encourage you to pick it up. Right now, local bookstores are struggling, so try to give them a shout out if you can. If you do read it, feel free to leave a review either at your local bookstore and one of the major outlets like Amazon or Barnes & Noble or whatever, or don't. Just send me a note saying how you felt about it, even if you hated it. I'd rather learn than not. And then above all else, I work at the religion news service, religionnews.com, and while I write a lot there, I am fortunate to work with an awesome team of people. And just yesterday, we got to break the story that Falwell was resigning until he unresigned and then resigned again from Liberty University.
No, he unresigned. I missed that part.
Yeah, he retracted his resignation and then by midnight finally resigned again. And so that, and we only did that because we work as a team of journalists. So religionnews.com, a lot of great things coming from there in the next few weeks. So.
Love it. Please, please, please support Jack, support Religion News Services and everything they're doing, support journalism, support all that stuff. Please go buy his book. Jack, we'll talk a little briefly here after I turn it off and everyone can just guess what we talked about. But I want to say, while it's still recording, thank you so much for your time. Thank you for what you're doing. It matters. I have been inspired deeply by watching your work and what you're up to. Keep going, man. We need you.
It means a lot. Thank you for having me.
Absolutely.